I don't think that we minimize China, is that we said there's a number of things that we care about in Africa that are strategic, and geopolitical competition with China is one of those, right? Again, not defined, but not divorced. So I think we will demonstrate that China is just one of the things that we think about in a nuanced way about when does it threaten U.S. interests? When does it undercut African sovereignty? I mean, those are the things that we focus on. And then showing that there's a whole bunch of other things that we are doing on the continent.
The anti-China agenda or narrative, it's a bipartisan issue right now in DC, and people like him are becoming more and more marginalized in the debate. It's becoming much more difficult for them to really get to that space where their voice starts to define and determines U.S. policy toward Africa. And this is, for me, the part where I think that he's going to have a hard time moving forward with that. And I don't know if he has that realization.
In terms of two-way trade, what is really coming in? Like, are we talking about trade from the United States to Angola? Because it would be interesting to see what products those would be, and whether there's also kind of planning, for example, for like global south transatlantic trade from Brazil, for example, which seems to make more sense maybe in the Angolan case.
There's a competition here, and time is not on African countries' side, because while they're struggling to build out this infrastructure to be able to have these kinds of factories, other countries in the global south are moving forward with the help of Australia, the US, and others.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Cape Town, South Africa, and our Africa editor, Geronima, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Eric.
Guys, when we originally planned to record this show, we were going to be doing a preview episode of U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Angola. This would have been his first visit to Angola, and I think the first visit of his administration and his first visit as president to Africa. But sadly, for Angolans who spent probably months and months preparing for this, it wasn't meant to be. Let's hear from the president.
As you know, I put out a statement this morning. I'm canceling my trip to Germany and to Africa. We're going to try to work those out later, but I just don't think I can be out of the country at this time. Number one. Number two, we're going to stay focused on what's ahead of us right now. I've been briefed by the senior leaders of this administration and who are driving our preparedness for Hurricane Milton, which could be one of the worst storms in 100 years to hit Florida, and continued efforts on Hurricane Helene. I've directed this team to do everything it can to save lives and our communities, help our communities before, during, and after these extreme weather events, and that's being done.
So the weather in South Florida is the culprit for undermining the president's trip. He made this promise to go to Africa in the 2022 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Jérôme, what do you think the reaction is, and based on what you were reading today in both the Angolan and African press, to the president's decision not to go?
I think there is a sense of understanding, but also disappointment at the same time. Understanding because it's not really his fault. It's not as if he's canceled the trip because of something that he could foresee. But he had to cancel the trip because what's happening in the US, it totally made sense for him to cancel that. So there is that also sense of disappointment because it was a highlight of a visit, an accomplishment, a fulfillment of a promise that was made in December 2022. And seeing that being sidelined by the unforeseeable situation of the hurricane that's now coming toward Miami in the US. So it's really that mix of a feeling that, I wish that you were there, but you couldn't make it, but somehow I understand you, but at the same time, I'm also disappointed that you are not there. So now the question becomes on when is going to be the next visit. We are talking about
postponement or cancellation or what. It's not really clear about that. As long as there's no new dates coming quick soon, there might be a sense of a much more deeper disappointment. So I do believe that they need to release a date quite fast, so to kind of appease people's mind to know that, it's just a delay. It's not a cancellation per se.
Well, there's probably not going to be a lot of time for the president to make the trip during his tenure, because let's not forget the election is November 6th, and there's a lot of expectation that this election is going to be turbulent, potentially even violent. And so it's hard to imagine that in the aftermath of the election, while votes are being counted and there's a lot of contentious behavior going on, that he's going to then pack up and leave. Then there's January 6th. Now, the famous January 6th from the Trump administration at the end of his tenure, every year it's always January 6th or around that time when they certify the election. Hard to imagine he's going to be out of town for that. So we have a very narrow window in December if he was to do it. Cobus, when I heard that he postponed, he didn't cancel, his official, and to Giraud's point, and Karine Jean-Pierre, the spokesperson for the White House, made it clear it was a postponement, not a cancellation. When I heard that, though, it brought me back to the Europe Africa Summit during the pandemic, when the Europeans canceled because they had the pandemic going on, but this was a virtual summit that they were supposed to have. And I just thought to myself, it's just so interesting how the U.S. and Europe, and I'm not trying to be hating on them in any way, but remember that Wang Yi, the foreign minister from China, he came to Africa, to Tanzania during the pandemic, and FOCAC was carried out during the pandemic, and we're just coming off of a FOCAC as well. And I just think the optics are very interesting here. As Giraud pointed out, totally legitimate reasons for President Biden to cancel. Everybody understands that. What's happening in South Florida is terrifying. He has to be there. But there's always something, okay? I mean, there's always something, and yet the U.S.-Africa relationship on a leadership level seems to suffer.
I agree with you. I think there's compelling reasons for him to stay, and I think that is understood in Africa, but it can't compound a larger dynamic, which is that Africa counts very low on US priorities. When we were in Washington earlier this year, one of the people we spoke to kind of frankly said that Africa is a lower priority for the US than both Oceania and the Arctic. So it's like actual penguins count for more than Africans, and so that's the larger kind of context in which this takes on meaning.
I was really looking forward to the president going because it was going to direct more attention to the Lobito corridor. That's an issue that we are taking seriously, in part because of our focus on supply chains, critical minerals, all of the different logistics that are going on in Southern Africa. We did a fantastic show a couple of weeks ago about the Tazara Railway. Giraud is doing more research now on Lobito and Tazara and the Port of Durban and all the different networks of how resources make their way from Africa to the various ports. And so the focus on Lobito was going to be really the highlight of his trip. And so it's brought a lot of attention to this new corridor. Before we kind of go into this, Giraud, maybe you can kind of just bring everybody up to speed as to when the U.S. talks about the Lobito corridor, what are they talking about?
Basically, they're talking about a wide range of projects that starts with the Benguela Railway that goes from Angola and the port of Lobito on the Atlantic coast in Angola till somewhere at the border with the DRC and Angola and the border with Angola and Zambia. They talk about that. This is the cornerstone of the Lobito. And now it's beside that, you do have now different developmental projects around it, solar power plants and telecom project and everything. Development approach the whole Lobito corridor project. So that's when they talk about Lobito. It's not only about logistics and transportation. It's about agriculture. It's about telecommunication. It's about green energy. So that's the whole plan that when they talk about Lobito. But unfortunately, it's always the logistic part because it has much more geopolitical component to it that's much more highlighted being in DC or in different media. So we don't always, and also by the US policymakers themselves. So at the end, people don't really pay attention to the whole complexity, to the whole package of what they say when they say Lobito corridor, which also, that's why for me, I'm kind of disagree with the wording of Lobito corridor because the terms of Lobito corridor is already coined by the African Development Bank and the logistic of African Development Bank. So it sometimes tends to kind of create a kind of differences. So this is basically what the Lobito corridor is from an American perspective.
That's an excellent introduction and really kind of sets up our conversation nicely here, because Acting Special Coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, PGII, Helena Matza, she was recently in your country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania. She was there in August, and she is the, if not the, or one of the top officials responsible for the U.S. government's initiative to refurbish the Lobito corridor. A lot of the work that she has been doing over the past several months and years is in preparation for the Biden visit to really highlight, again, a showcase of American engagement in Africa and specifically Angola. She recently held a digital press briefing on the Lobito corridor expansion that was no doubt going to be, again, a central theme of President Biden's visit. And one of the key questions that hangs over this Lobito project is, how will the U.S. backing of infrastructure development in Africa be different from what China's been doing on the continent for the past several decades, especially as it relates to debt? Let's hear what Helena had to say, and we'll hear first from the moderator who presented the question to Helena Matza.
The next question comes from Kate Bartlett from Voice of America. And she says, and she asks, the US has been critical of China's grand infrastructure projects for what it says is unsustainable levels of debt African countries end up taking on. How will the US avoid this? Secondly, will any of the critical minerals that this corridor is all about be processed and refined in African countries or exported raw? Thank you.
So I think that points right to the model that we're discussing here. We're working directly with not only the host governments, but private partners in how to finance these projects. And this is why that's important. What we're doing is not trying to expand upon the debt of the countries we're working in. We're not trying to work against that balance sheet. What we're doing instead is bringing a developer or working with a developer in country that's interested in being there, but needs help and support to get the project done, both in feeling confident that they have the support they need by both governments, but also in some financing support. This is a really different model that helps our government partners who are restructuring debt right now. Almost every country that we're talking about in the Lobito group, at least, and in some of our other flagship initiatives also, invest in infrastructure that they couldn't because they have to go through that debt restructuring piece of their agenda. So we think this is a unique way. Now, there will be grants and MDBs participating in this work, but this is what we think is different about this model. The other piece is this model really is not designed to be extractive. It's designed for economic growth, which I know sometimes sounds like a buzzword, but that's why we're focused on trade moving in both directions. We want, as materials continue to move into regional and global markets, that we think about how we can help the ag distribution within the continent, for example, an example I already shared. And a good chunk of projects, including the one I included in my opening remarks, is focused on exactly what you said about critical minerals. It's not about, for us, extracting raw ore. In fact, we're thinking about how we help finance the ecosystem for beneficiation in country, in other partner countries, to be part of the global battery ecosystem as it continues to develop. This, we hope, is a response to our partner countries' desire to continue to move further up the value chain, but it's aligned with our own goals also. We need to see more resiliency in these supply chains in every step of the way. And being able to do some of this work closer to where these resources are a piece of that puzzle, in addition to all the investments that we're focused on and making at home. These are going to be big markets. There's a lot of electrification to happen. There's a lot of EV deployments. There's space to participate in it for, we think, all our partners. And that's part of what we like about the Lifezone project in Tanzania. It's what we like about some of the work that we're doing in Zambia and some work we're working on in the DRC, but are not quite ready to talk about yet.
Okay, Cobus, it's not a pit to port type of project. There's a lot more in there. Giraud laid it out that this is not just about a railway. When you hear Helena Matza lay it out that way, are you sold?
Yes and no. Like, yes, in terms of, acknowledging that there are plans for a wider ecosystem and that some of these ambitions really are, do seem to be, aimed at broader based industrialization. But no, in terms of that, we also know that in a lot of other discussions around the Lobito corridor, there's already been, identification of refinement sites for exports in like Baltimore and in Europe, so that in some of the other reading, I've done around the project, that is openly discussed. So it's not like, that hasn't been on the table. At the same time, one of the questions that her comments raised for me is, in terms of two-way trade, what is really coming in? Like, are we talking about trade from the United States to Angola? Because it would be interesting to see what products those would be, and whether there's also kind of planning, for example, for like global south transatlantic trade from Brazil, for example, which, seems to make more sense maybe in the Angolan case.
Giraud, we're going to give you the last word before we get to our guest. What do you think when you hear Helena Matza kind of lay it out this way?
A lot of politics, I'd say, because when I really pay attention closely to her answer, I really had a hard time to really pick up the answer to the question that was asked. She alluded to a certain way, but she didn't really address the deep concern in terms of financing, and she was not really clear.
Well, it's not sovereign debt, is what she's saying. It's not going to be a loan from the China or the U.S. Exim Bank to...
But then what is it?
Well, what she said, what she laid it out. She made it very clear what it is. It's all of these initiatives piled in together, and she's going to be pairing private sector with investment opportunities, and that's the role that the government is playing in all of this. And she's that facilitator, or her team is that facilitator, to bring those two together, which is healthier if it works.
Okay.
Healthier, much healthier.
Okay, I see. The element of refining on the ground as well. This is one of the points that, the answer she gave, we're trying, but if it was meeting the demand of local host countries, building refineries should have been the first priority before building the railway, because the railway was functional. That's a fact, it was functional. It was just maybe not up to par to what they wanted, but it was functional. So for me, yes, there is, as I said, there is a lot of willingness to really marketing it as something much more, and she said it. But I think the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details, and the details of the contract, the details of the intentions as well. So you're going to have to go in the nitty-gritty and the priorities, how they're set and how they're laid out. And so far, she mentioned the DRC. She said, but we are not ready to have that conversation yet. So this is where, for me, I'm getting even much more curious in that regard, because you're leaving the DRC out of the equation for now, but it's the very much big part of the chunk when you talk about critical minerals and everything. So when are we going to have that conversation about the DRC, and which part and what part is going to play, and how it's going to unfold over there? So for me, I still have my doubts and my question, but it's a very interesting project that she presented.
But are you, both of you, because I sense skepticism, but are you generally favorable of what the U.S. is doing in Angola, or are you critical of it? I'm trying to figure out where you kind of fall on it, because...
Me, I'm agnostic to what they're doing, as long as they come clean about what they're doing. As long as they say, if it's about geopolitics, and it's about this, it's about countering this, it's about countering that, and we're putting money for that. Yes, for me, it's like, okay, at least you take ownership of really what you want to do and what you're planning on, what you're doing with that. It's not for me presenting it on some way, but having a different motive on that. That's why I say I'm really agnostic to what the US is doing. If they do something really that boosts development, economic growth, as she said, and all of that, I'm completely open to that. I'm completely so, because it's always something good. But if it's used now as a geopolitical tools and everything, but not really taking ownership that it's a geopolitical tool, this is for me, I'm like, I don't know.
Well, originally, again, we had planned to talk about President Joe Biden's visit to Angola, which got canceled this week. And so I invited our old friend Judd Devermont, who is the former senior director for African Affairs on the U.S. National Security Council. That's basically the point person in the White House on Africa foreign policy. He's now an operating partner at Kupanda Capital in Washington, D.C., and we turned to him as our kind of guide on U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. And again, originally I had the plan to talk with him about the visit, but I figured, hey, we've got him booked. Let's take advantage of this opportunity to get his take on where we are today in U.S. foreign policy towards Africa, the visit, the Lobito corridor, and how China fits into all of this. Let's take a listen to our discussion with Judd Devermont. Judd, great to have you back on the show. I think this is the first time we've had a chance to speak with you since you're out of government, and really just a wonderful time to catch up with you.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here, Eric. I think this is my fourth time on the show, so I don't know where I rank, but I'm working on it.
You're definitely getting up there in the top tier. You know, like on Saturday Night Live, they have a club for those who've hosted 5 times. So we'll send you a jacket after you've been on 5 times. Then you get your jacket, your China Africa Project jacket.
Lovely.
Let's talk about the aborted visit of U.S. President Joe Biden to Angola. There was a lot of expectation that he was going to go. He was going to talk about the Libido corridor. This was going to be really Angola's moment to shine. I mean, Angola's invested a lot in trying to attract U.S. attention. There's millions of dollars apparently have been spent on lobbying in Washington and building this relationship up. No doubt that folks in Luanda are disappointed over the president's decision. When you look at the politics of it, looking back on it, I mean, it was kind of crazy that a president would travel 30 days before an election, but it was impossible that he could travel under the circumstances that we have now with the hurricanes bearing down on the southeast of the United States. But let's talk about the impact that the cancellation may have. It feels to a lot of folks, including myself, that this is a pretty big setback for U.S. policy in Africa, that especially coming on the heels of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit in Beijing, which by all accounts was seen as a big success, that the president not going is an indication of just not showing up. What's your take on the cancellation?
Well, like anyone, I'm really disappointed that he's not going. I'm not in government anymore, but I'm on the sidelines and rooting for stronger U.S.-African relations, and this was going to be a pretty important trip. Now, my view, honestly, Eric, is that the president still intends to go. I mean, they're calling it a postponement. Whether it's in his scripted or unscripted remarks, he's constantly talking about how he wants to go to Africa. So I'm treating this as a postponement, and I think our Angolan counterparts understand how difficult it would have been for him to travel during the hurricane. And it's only a real setback if he doesn't go. At this point, it's just a pause.
There's a very narrow window of time left for the president to actually go. So we have the election on November 6th. A lot of people believe that this is going to be a contested election. It's going to be very close. There's even the prospect of violence and unrest. Unlikely that he would go until that is resolved and settled. And then January 6th, as we know, is when the election is certified in the Congress. That, too, is going to be a very important day. Unlikely that he's going to be out of the country around that time, too. And then towards the end of January, he's gone. So we really have a window in early December when he can go.
It's certainly a small window, but as a student of U.S.-African relations, we've had presidents who have traveled to Africa after elections, after they are no longer going to be there for a second term. President George H.W. Bush traveled to Somalia around Christmas and New Year's because we had troops in Somalia and he went to go visit them. So there is a precedent for this. It's a short window. He wasn't going to spend a huge amount of time. This was going to be a 36-hour trip, something to that effect. So I think there's an opportunity. And by the way, just for your listeners, it's not just that, he had to cancel this Angola trip, but he also canceled the trip to Germany where he was going to be meeting with a number of heads of states, Schultz and Macron and Strammer and Zelensky. So there was a lot of big ticket items that he was planning to do on this trip that all got washed away by the hurricane.
Yeah, but let's talk about Angola, though. I mean, you've been thinking a lot about Angola, and obviously with the president going or not going doesn't really change U.S. policy towards Angola. Why has Angola, more than almost any other country in the continent in the past year, stood out as a major priority for the U.S.? What is it about Angola that is so appealing to the Americans?
Angola, with the election of João Lorenzo back in 2017, on his inaugural address, he essentially signaled that he wanted to work more closely with the U.S. and with Europe. He wasn't to supplant China or to supplant Russia, but he signaled that this was important to him. And so the Bush team did a little bit. They sent their Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State to visit Angola. But when we came in, we really took it very seriously that they wanted a partnership. And there was a number of things that we were doing together that I think exemplify what the Biden approach to Africa is about. So first of all, we're collaborating and consulting with the Angolans on some of the biggest issues globally, the Russian war in Ukraine, as well as regional issues, the fighting in Eastern Congo, for example, and the diplomacy that we are all working on there. But and I know that Africans have been asking for more investment in infrastructure from the United States. That has not been what we've done in the past outside of MCC programs. And there was an opportunity to do something different, to build or refurbish the rail. That's the old Benguela Railway, but also focus on clean energy through a solar project, to work with telecom so that we had mobile money and we had different kind of investments there. There was an opportunity for working on agriculture. So the Angolans and then the DRC and the Zambians together, we decided that this was an opportunity based on their signaling for us to answer the call to do more on infrastructure, but do it in a holistic way that has benefits for us, but also has benefits for our African partners.
Now, this focus on infrastructure, the perception for a lot of people outside of the U.S. and outside of the D.C. Beltway, where you spend a lot of time, is that this is playing catch up to the Chinese, particularly in a place like Angola, where the Chinese have been very active, obviously in their debt and their deals and their oil, infrastructure, lots of things. The Chinese are very active in Angola. How much do you get the sense, and this really transcends the arc of before you were in government to when you were in government to now, how much do you get the sense that the desire to do these kinds of programs is motivated in part by a desire to catch up with the Chinese, or at least to compete with the Chinese in this infrastructure space in Africa?
Well, you know that I believe that our Africa policy is about U.S. and African relations. And at the same time, it is not divorced from geostrategic competition. So not defined by geostrategic competition, not divorced from it. And so you can look at it in terms of those two bins, right? Africans have been very thankful, and we're very proud of the work that we have been doing on health and development and the role of our private sector in a number of sectors. But we've recognized for many years that the continent has the lowest road and rail density in the world, and we weren't playing a major role in helping to contribute to that. So this is one opportunity, and it really comes down to the president with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment saying we are going to do infrastructure around the world. And then, of course, the Chinese have been doing it for a very long time. There has been mixed results. Some of those programs and projects, as you know, have been marked by corruption or have not paid dividends, but there are programs and projects that Africans value. So this is our opportunity to show up, to show what the U.S. value proposition is, to answer what Africans are asking from us, and showing that there is a U.S. version of infrastructure investment in Africa that is aligned with our values and that brings the private sector in a holistic manner to different parts of the continent.
Now, that's a much more nuanced view than we usually hear on politics in Washington. And I talk to a lot of people like you who are in the space. They're getting their hands dirty in this policy. They're actually on the ground. They know how this works. They hear what Africans are telling them and what Angolans are telling them. They don't want to be sandwiched in between the U.S. and China and whatnot. But the other reality of Washington is that if you want to get money from Congress, you have to say certain things, because on Capitol Hill, they're nowhere near as nuanced in their understanding about these issues as you are and as you've laid this out. This view that you've laid out, how prevalent do you think it is in Washington in terms of how people see these issues? I mean, I'm sold on what you say, but it's very, very different from what I hear elsewhere in Washington.
One of the things that we want to do with the Africa strategy is that we wanted to identify and enumerate the different reasons why the U.S. relationship is strategic with Africans. And that's everything from geostrategic competition and defining the rules of the international system, to clean energy, to global health, to food security. And the reason why that was important is because there have been moments in our past, most of the moments, where African policy is hijacked by one single lens, whether it's Soviet Union rivalry in the Cold War, or terrorism, or development and health. We wanted to say that there's multiple lenses that we look at the continent with. Now, we have partners in the legislative side or in other parts of the Washington ecosystem that may look at only one lens. But if you listened and what I said, the way in which this libido corridor is happening, it's hitting a whole bunch of different things: trade and investment, infrastructure, clean energy. And so for me, it's a yes and. Yes, I understand that that's a priority. It's a priority for me. There are things that I am very concerned about. I've talked to on the podcast before that China does in Africa, but I've also got other things that we want to achieve with our projects and programs, and the people that we need to work with across the aisle in the legislative branch. We can talk about all of those things together.
And so on the Libido corridor, that would have been a major priority, if not the priority, for the president in Angola to talk about. Certainly, the U.S. has made more progress with the Libido corridor than any other major infrastructure initiative, certainly in Africa. And I think we can make the case probably worldwide in the current era right now. The U.S. is not known for financing infrastructure, and the progress that it's made on the Libido corridor is way more advanced than what we've seen elsewhere.
Eric, this is the president's signature global initiative, and the Libido corridor is the most advanced, the most fulsome of the PGI programming.
But there are some warning signs, though, and we've heard these warning signs on this podcast, and we've seen them in the administration from a couple of years ago. In 2022, Secretary Antony Blinken sat down with the Zambians and the Congolese to sign the EV battery supply chain kind of support. And it was an MOU. They couldn't get it out of the MOU stage because coordinating among the Zambians, the Congolese, the Americans, and others proved too difficult. We've heard on this show in a recent episode talking about the Tazara Railway and the difficulties that Tanzania and Zambia have had in managing that railway that, since the Chinese built it in the 60s, has underperformed and has not lived up to anywhere near its potential. And I think that suggests that there is some difficulties ahead in doing transnational projects. So the Libido corridor goes from Angola into Zambia, and then there's also ideas for building corridors into the Congo and even going all the way across the U.S. That's ambitious, given the track record of building transnational projects in Africa. Large projects and large complex systems tend to run into problems. Now, the question is, does that give pause to the State Department, the PGI teams, and the president that this initiative may be exciting, but also difficult to pull off?
I always start with, what do Africans want and say? And the idea of a transcontinental economic corridor is something that has been at the forefront since the dawn of independence. And it is something that is in Agenda 2063. It is what is animating the African Continental Free Trade Area. In fact, Secretary General Mene just talked about the Libido corridor and his excitement for it. So first of all, we are raising our game because that's what Africans are laying out as their agenda. That doesn't mean it's not easy. It is hard. And we could talk about this infrastructure project. We could also talk about one of the things that I'm the most proud of about the Biden administration is really pushing for African voices in global governance. It takes two to tango. So we're going to do all the things that we need to do to show up and to do the financing for our partners, our private sector, and our African partners are going to need to show up in terms of helping to work through the problems that may arise, whether it's internal to a specific country or as two countries work together, or three countries or four countries. But if we want to do things that are going to be transformative, of course it's going to be hard, but we should have the ambition to try.
Do you think it's possible, and let's ground this in reality, that the Libido corridor could one day be linked up to the Tazara to create that west-east, east-west connection? Or will the United States have to go out on its own and build a separate rail line, which is being discussed, that they may have to build a new rail line all the way out, possibly to other points beyond Dar es Salaam, because it may be too difficult either to deal with the Zambians-Tanzania relationship in the Tazara, or the fact that the Chinese may have an operating license, and that would create challenges too.
I think it's very possible, and I think that's the best option. The best option is for us to connect Tazara and Libido, to have one single rail line to cut across the continent and move people and goods in the most efficient and effective way. It's something that I've talked to the Tazara board about when I was in government and they were interested in it. The PGI acting coordinator, Helena Matza, was just in Tanzania and in her remarks to the press talked about that as a possibility. So there are things that the United States needs to do to make that happen, and we've laid that out already. There are things that the African governments need to do in terms of their negotiations with us and with the Chinese. And there are things the Chinese need to do. And this is particularly around the question around real free access. If the Chinese decide to pre-book everything on Tazara in a way that none of it's discriminatory towards other companies or countries, then we're not going to be able to do this. So everyone's got to pitch in, because I think this could benefit everyone. And that's consistent with our values. We're talking about, when we talk at the highest levels, we're talking about an even playing field with rules and norms that we all agree on and work together on. It's something that Secretary Blinken has said. It's something that Jake Sullivan has said, the National Security Advisor. And so I think Tazara is a test case, but everyone's going to have to put away a little ego, put away some of the rhetoric, and work together in a way that makes sure it protects U.S. interests and African interests.
As far as you know, are there any restrictions for Chinese entities to use the Libido corridor? If Chinese companies wanted to use the Libido corridor to transport their resources, would there be any restrictions on that as far as you know?
I don't know of that, but I do know that the Chinese have already used it once. They've used Libido.
I seem to recall that there was some initiatives to try and restrict Chinese access to Libido. And I don't have it off the top of my head, but I might be completely making that up. But this idea of open access on either of the railways or all the railways makes all the sense in the world to me, that everybody can go anywhere.
Yeah, so Chinese firms have used Libido because in part some of the other options are not very viable, like the Durban route. And so the Libido Atlantic Railway's first customer was a joint venture between Ivanhoe Mines and Chinese Xi'an Mining. So, I mean, it's happened before. Look, all of us have to work together to protect all of our sovereign interests. And that's going to be part of the thing that we have to continue to watch as this moves along.
Take us inside government and how it works, because I think some of us may not know. But let's say there was this opportunity where everybody said that they were willing to sit down and have a conversation about linking up the Tazara and the Libido. And by the way, I just want to make it very clear, there's no indication that those conversations have started or will start anytime soon. I just want to understand, if this were to work, how would this happen? Because you've got the Angolans, you've got the Congolese, you've got the Tanzanians, you've got the Zambians, you've got the Chinese state companies, you've got the U.S. government. What kind of forum does this happen in to have these kinds of conversations? And particularly because there are not a lot of venues where the U.S. and Chinese now talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's usually at a very high level. It's usually in very scripted, choreographed environments. And so the pressure would be on just because of the U.S.-China presence there. But what would be the forum to have those conversations to pursue the objective that you are thinking about now, about linking Tazara and Libido? How would that work?
Well, so first, this starts with Africans. This starts with the Tanzanians, the Angolans, the Congolese, and the Zambians saying that this is what they want. They think is the most optimal solution. And by the way, Eric, I've done some research, and I actually found out that Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first leader of Zambia, was actually talking about adding a route, the Benguela rail line, to Tazara in the process of the building of Tazara. So this is something that actually started many, many years ago, decades ago. So first, the Africans have to say this is what they want. And I believe this is true in all of the different sectors where there's U.S. and African economic competition. The Africans have to say we have rules around transparency. We have rules about non-discriminatory uses of rail and cargo and shipments, and that you, the U.S., and you, the Chinese, have to agree to those. And if there's an agreement to use this infrastructure in an agnostic way, I think people can get on board. It is when the Chinese decide that actually there will be no American shipments that go on Tazara or vice versa. And by the way, Eric, just for your listeners, because this is so interesting, we're talking about this like they're dueling railways, right? Like one's the Chinese rail and one's the U.S. finance nail, which is not the case. So the United States in the 1980s spent $45 million to help refurbish Tazara. And prior to the U.S. role in Benguela, the Chinese had refurbished it. So I reject that this is one person's rail or one country's rail or another country's rail. The only people that own these rails are the Africans, and they can set the table for how they want us to engage.
That's right. So and also it's important that it's General Electric locomotives, if I understand, that are still running on the Tazara, and those were paid for by the Americans. And again, I think, too, it's very tempting to put this into a colonial context where, again, it's the U.S. and China that are going to take control of these railways. These are concessions that we are talking about, not ownership. And I think that's a very important distinction. Very quickly before we go, because I know you need to get back to your wine tasting in Sonoma, we want to talk about just U.S. policy.
You're going to give people the wrong idea about private sector life, Eric.
That's right. But you're in a beautiful part of the world this time, and I'm envious of you right now, sitting here in hot and sweaty Southeast Asia. Very quickly, we just wrapped up FOCAC. What comes out of FOCAC is a consistency, a predictability. We have these declarations. This is the vision for the next 3 years. they've got the same multi-billion-dollar announcements, and you and I have talked about this before, that you guys did in Washington at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Global Gateway has them. We've talked about at length on the show how we don't think those numbers are as important as a lot of the declarations, the plans, the side deals, and the relationships that come out of these summits. That being said, there is a pretty clear vision now of what Chinese policy for Africa is, at least for the next 3 years. I struggle to understand the U.S. vision for Africa because we don't have this consistency. We don't have these forums that happen on a regular basis, this high-level engagement. More African leaders went to Beijing than came to the UN General Assembly. We don't have these types of interactions. Help us understand where you see U.S. foreign policy towards Africa today. And we're in a very difficult situation right now because there may be a new president in the White House next year. Well, there definitely will be a new president in the White House, but a new direction. Vice President Harris will probably continue a lot of the Biden policies, whereas Donald Trump will take the country in a very different direction. That being said, what's your assessment in 2024, October-November period of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa today?
As you know, Eric, the United States had a very consistent approach towards Africa in the late 90s, early 2000s, and early 2010s. It was preceded by a lot of confusion about U.S. policy towards Africa as the Cold War ended and the post-Cold War era was still figuring its footing, and you saw not as much engagement in Africa in the beginning part of the Clinton administration, and you saw a lot of different approaches that just didn't really work in the way that one wanted them to do. And then it started to solidify in late Clinton and then really, I think, hit the ground running under President Bush. And those two presidents are the most popular U.S. presidents in Africa still to this day. And that's the kind of moment that we're in now. And I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs back in June on this, but we are crafting a policy towards Africa that reflects the changes globally and reflects the changes on the continent. To have 30 years of a consistent policy is wonderful, except for things change. And so we had to do some real thinking about where do we go. And part of that, as we've alluded to already, is recognizing that Africans are critical to the governance of our international system, that we're not going to have a durable international system unless Africans have a seat at the table, and we think about Africans in a strategic way. So in the Biden administration, I was asked to write the Africa strategy. We laid that out. I'm extraordinarily proud of the things that we have done, right? The first summit in 8 years, first state visit in 16 years. I'm very hopeful that President Biden will still travel. That'll be the first trip for a U.S. president to Africa in 9 years. And all of the commitments we've made, our private sector really gearing up and making investments, and the Libido Corridor, and the work that we're doing on digital, and our advocacy for Africans at the UN Security Council or in the IMF or in the G20. So there's a framework there that I think, yes, the Harris administration will continue, and she will add some of her own vision. I mean, her trip to Tanzania and Zambia and Ghana was really tremendous. And the focus she had on women empowerment, on digital inclusion, on climate. So I think that is set, and really looking forward for her to win the election and to bring her optimism and to bring her commitment to Africa and keep moving us forward in this, what I would call strategic pivot on how we think about the continent. We are at a place, though, where it's not clear what the Trump administration policy will be. His last 4 years was pretty dismissive and mean-spirited, full of travel bans. And, I am concerned. And so I understand our African partners kind of putting their finger into the wind and asking, where will we go? But I don't think even the Trump team, and I'm surprised I'm quoting Agenda 2025 here, but actually there's an Africa section in Agenda 2025, and it talks about the role of Africans as critical in our global governance and in the world. So even some of the ideas that we introduced in our administration, some of them seem to be showing up in some of the Trump documents. Now, form is different than function, but I understand that people are concerned about that and see continuity with the Chinese and a little less with us. But we have laid out a vision that I think is exactly right for the 21st century. And now the question is just implementation.
One of the big changes that you made in your strategy was that you de-emphasized the role of China in the Africa strategy, which in the Trump administration was very prominent, if not central. I remember the Secretary of State constantly going to, and again, whether it was Tillerson or later, China, 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 China was the message every time they went to Africa. You minimize that considerably. Do you get the sense that, because the perception is still from many in Africa today, is that the only reason that the U.S. is interested in Africa beyond military is because of China? Your strategy really changed all of that. But how do you combat that perception there? Again, we talked about it in the libido corridor context, and also, there is just this idea. And the Chinese, by the way, fuel this. If you look at Chinese media, they're constantly saying, the Americans are just doing this to catch up with us. The Americans are just doing this to counter us, and so forth and so forth. So they absolutely feed that narrative. But there are perceptions in Africa, too, that the U.S. is only interested and remains engaged because of the Chinese. Again, you changed that in your strategy document, but how do you combat that if that's not in fact the case?
Well, by the way, it's not just Chinese media, it's also U.S. media.
That's fair.
It is a longstanding bugaboo of mine that any headline about Africa and U.S. policy includes China and or Russia, even for things that really have nothing to do with those two countries. And I would quibble a little bit, Eric. I don't think that we minimize China. Is that we said there's a number of things that we care about in Africa that are strategic, and geopolitical competition with China is one of those, right? Again, not defined, but not divorced. So I think we will demonstrate that China is just one of the things that we think about. And again, in a nuanced way about when does it threaten U.S. interests? When does it undercut African sovereignty? I mean, those are the things that we focus on. And then showing that there's a whole bunch of other things that we are doing on the continent. I'll tell you something that I'm really proud of, Eric, that doesn't get a lot of attention. We worked with our African partners. The Chinese abstained, but we worked with our African partners to pass a resolution last December that said that the UN could fund up to 75% of African peacekeeping missions. We actually did an amendment to the original resolution that we got enough people to vote for. The Russians and the Chinese did not. And then they did vote on the final resolution. But we have opened up the door for African leadership to respond to crises in their continent with predictable funding from the UN. So on a whole range of things, we are working to show that we see the continent as critical, that the health of the continent and the prosperity and peace in the continent is good for everyone. And by doing these number of different issues, putting them together or separately, is the way that we show that it's not just about China, although that is important and I don't want to minimize it. It is part of the project that we have in terms of our relationship with the continent, and it's just one facet.
Judd Devermont is an operating partner at Kupanda Capital in Washington, D.C., and a former senior director for African Affairs on the U.S. National Security Council at the White House, and one of the sharpest minds in the U.S. foreign policy community focused on Africa. Judd, we thank you so much for taking time out of your wine country tour that you're on right now up in beautiful Sonoma County in my home state of Northern California. So thank you so much for your time and your insights, and we really appreciate it. And you have some articles that I know you're working on, and as soon as those come out, we're looking forward to showcasing them and sharing them with everybody.
Eric, it's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to my 5-timer jacket.
Guys, it's always a pleasure to have the chance to talk with Judd. I really do feel like he's one of the smartest guys in D.C. when it comes to thinking about Africa, but also in the historical context. Giro, you and I have talked about a lot in the past, how many Americans have historical amnesia. They don't understand the role that the U.S. has played in Africa. Judd is not one of those people. He really is. He's just passionate about U.S.-Africa relations. I raised this with him in my discussion. I wonder whether his textured, nuanced responses really are very much the mainstream in Washington, or do we see like what we saw on Capitol Hill and in many other parts of the Capitol and in the United States now? China's such a polarizing issue. Cobus talked about penguins being more important than Africa. And I just wonder if there's how much room there is for somebody as nuanced as Judd is in this discourse in the United States that is so just binary, zero-sum, filled with mis and disinformation. And a guy like Judd, he brings so much thought, but those, lots of thought in Washington today, those don't go well together. Cobus, what's your take?
I agree. In speaking with Judd, it's always a treat, and he's so smart on Africa. And he and the kind of cohort of DC people who focus on Africa really have a very fine-grained, nuanced take on the continent and also on China's role there.
There's quite a few of them too, right? I mean,
there is.
Yeah, there's quite a few people who are like that. There's a good community of people there.
There is, but distinctly a minority in Washington, and I think, once one moves out of that kind of cohort of Africa-focused people, the narratives about Africa flatten very quickly, even among very smart people who are very smart on other issues in the world, and so I think it's very hard for Africa to escape kind of a preset kind of discursive position that it's always put in. And that kind of reflects Africa's larger kind of position in the world, which is kind of defined by a mix of exploitation and marginalization. I think it's very difficult for like a broader DC, non-Africa focused DC to really kind of move beyond that particular trap, I think.
Géraud, you weren't able to join me for the interview because it was too early in the morning for your time, but you had a chance to look at the transcript, and there were some parts of what Judd said that I got the sense that you didn't 100% agree with.
Judd, as you presented him, is very, very smart and very loving about Africa in general. And he was clear about his idea what Africa, what the U.S. should be, what the role he should be playing with Africa, what the approach of the U.S. should be on the continent. And of course, I would really like his nuanced perspective and also his clarity of mind when he really made this statement by saying that the U.S. engagement in Africa is not about geopolitics, but it's not also divorced from it. It's a kind of mix of that. It's not about China, but it's also about China in a certain way. And as to the point that you mentioned, people like Judd.
But I feel there's a but coming here. I feel like you've buttered up Judd very well, but where's the but? Let's get to that.
No. So the point I wanted to make is like, yes, people like Judd will have a hard time to get their voice heard and getting things moving forward because the anti-China agenda or narrative, it's a bipartisan issue right now in DC, and people like him are becoming more and more marginalized in the debate. It's becoming much more difficult for them to really get to that space where their voice start to define and determines U.S. policy toward Africa. And this is, for me, the part where I think that he's going to have a hard time moving forward with that. And I don't know if he has that realization. I know that he's well-intended. He really wants to get things moving.
Well, I think he knows quite well.
Yeah, he knows quite well. He's been there. He knows how the system works. But now how to get it, take its shape and form, this is something else. So no, there is no but. There's no specific but about what he said. But yeah.
Again, as I mentioned in the discussion with Judd, a lot of the direction of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa and how China factors into that is going to depend on what happens on November 6th and what happens in the U.S. election. If it is a Harris administration, we're probably going to see a continuation of the strategy that Judd wrote, where China was much less emphasized than what it was during the Trump administration. If Trump comes back, my guess is you're going to see a lot more focus on what China's doing, not only in Africa, but also elsewhere around the world. Very quickly before we go, and this might seem like a tangential issue, but you heard Helena Matza talk about battery supply chains in Angola. Géraud, this is a topic you have been talking about quite a bit. And it just got me thinking because I'm out here in Southeast Asia and I focus a lot on what happens out here in Southeast Asia. And I know a lot of folks in Africa may not follow the events that are happening here, but there was an announcement by the Australians and the Philippines last month about a new lithium phosphate battery plant, $122 million gigafactory in the Clark Economic Zone. And by the way, the Clark Economic Zone is on the former U.S. military base, Clark, in the Clark base in the Philippines. And that will produce 2 gigawatts of battery power each year by 2030. It's going to employ 2,500 people. This is the first lithium iron phosphate battery plant in the Philippines. And what's interesting here is that despite the crazy tensions between China and the Philippines over territorial disputes in the South China Sea, that was not an issue for this project. The STB Gigafactory is an Australian-Chinese joint venture. Let's take a listen to the promotional video released by the Australian Embassy that features remarks by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. when he commissioned the new plant last month.
I cannot overstate the importance of this investment. It sends this message to the world. The Philippines is now ready to innovate, to lead, to become the go-to destination for high-tech, high-impact investments. This inauguration of the St. B Giga Factory is a remarkable example of what happens when our national agenda of promoting clean energy intersects with a solid commitment from the private sector. Your Excellency, Ambassador, you hit the nail on the head there.
Together, Australia and the Philippines, we are making important strides towards the world of our dreams.
To the entire team behind the St. B Giga Factory, thank you for taking this leap of faith with us. You have established a foundation for a cleaner, greener, and more prosperous Bagong Pilipinas.
Okay, there it is. It's the Saint B, not STB. So Saint B. I stand corrected on that. Géraud, when I hear this, I think about all the talk of building battery plants and moving up the value chain in Zimbabwe, in Angola. We've talked about it even in Morocco. And yet it hasn't happened to the point where they've built a gigafactory like what they have done in the Philippines. And what's interesting about the Philippines is that in a development context, the Philippines very much parallels a lot of African countries in terms of its level of development, poverty levels, infrastructure, and a lot of things like that. So I guess the takeaway for me is that there's a competition here, and time is not on African countries' side. Because while they're struggling to build out this infrastructure to be able to have these kinds of factories, other countries in the global south are moving forward with the help of Australia, the U.S., and others. When you hear that happening in the Philippines, what do you think?
I think that they've made the demand for local value chain a bit later the curve. Countries like Indonesia or Philippines, they started to make those demands way earlier. I think they were much more forward-looking into understanding how the market in this country was changing and how they needed those local value chain to be built on the ground. And they were also, when they made those demand, African countries, they're kind of distracted or blindsided, or I don't know what to say, but they lose sight of the fact that they did not have the prerequisites to attract the kind of value chain development they were asking for those mining companies in their countries. And this is where, despite the fact that they imposed ban on different export and everything, but still they haven't seen any major investment. It's only earlier this month that a company like Sinomin in Zimbabwe announced that it's going to build a $500 million lithium sulfate plant in Zimbabwe in the next 3 to 5 years. And yes, they also complain about the business environment in Zimbabwe. So yes, it's only now that we are seeing a certain kind of move, but by the time those moves are taking shape, by the time they build on the ground, the reality of the market will be that the industry will move away from many of those minerals. At some point, you're going to realize that maybe we didn't need those factories after all, because, for instance, just like DRC wanting to build a processing plant, advanced processing plants for cobalt. What's happened if in the next 5 years, cobalt is so outdated for the EV industries? And same thing can happen with lithium. So we have the market changing, and many African countries are just not ahead of the curve, just way behind the curve, and the demands are just, I don't know, a bit late in so different levels, industrial levels, and the prerequisites are not there. So I'm really feeling bad for them, and I'm really wondering what's going to be the next move from many of them.
Okay, Cobus, I'm going to give you the unenviable task of help us try to bring all of the themes that we've talked about over this past hour together, starting with what Helena was talking about, the comments from Judd, and then these issues, in terms of competitiveness that Géraud's talking about. How does this all fit together?
One of the points where I think all of them are touching is around the African governments and African continental bodies moving a lot quicker towards integrating African markets. In order to present what I think is Africa's largest asset in this discussion, which is actually not critical minerals, but being the last emerging market. Africa is 1.2 billion people but at the moment it's this completely fractured market, particularly kind of much divided by more robust borders than in most other, continental markets. So, African governments traditionally have had a lot riding on the kind of value extraction that they could get from borders. And so there's a lot of red tape that needs to be undone in Africa in order to facilitate the integration of African markets. Once that takes on speed, then both initiatives like the Lubija Corridor and this kind of battery manufacturing, possibly whatever that would look like at that stage, starts making more sense, right? Kind of the battery manufacturing doesn't necessarily have to happen in Africa because of African critical minerals. It can happen in Africa because African markets are nearby. And this is, it's a very young population. They're going to need a lot of batteries for everything, for EVs, for phones, for everything. So in that sense, I think the Africans have to move a lot quicker in that direction, and obviously the free trade area, a lot of that legal work has already been done. And what now needs to be done is to make it easier for people and goods to move across borders, particularly legally. And so, I wish the Africans would just speed it up. Actually, I think that's my bottom line.
Okay, that was actually, I presented you a rather sizable challenge and you nailed it, so that was pretty good. Listen, this week we talked about the U.S. Next week, we're actually going to focus on Europe and a whole discussion about what Europe should be doing and is doing, much like what we're talking about with the U.S. So make sure you join us for that. So we'll just do U.S. this week, Europe next week. Jérôme and I will talk with some fascinating analysts about some of the new European initiatives in Africa. And again, you'll hear some interesting contrasts and some similarities, actually. So, but the Europeans and the Americans, not 100% on the same page when it comes to these things. Let's leave our conversation there. This is the kind of stuff that we do every single day at the China Global South Project. We are a global team producing the only, as far as I know, guys, I don't know if you know any other service that does anything remotely close to what we do in terms of following what China is doing in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas every single day. We're thrilled to be able to serve governments, we serve corporates, we serve universities, multilateral institutions, and we'd like to have you join our growing community of readers. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable. We kept them intentionally affordable in order so that the most people possible could enjoy the great work that Jérôme and Cobus and the others on the team are doing. And if you are a student or a teacher, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you half off links for subscriptions to our service starting at just $10 a month. So even a broke student can afford that. Hopefully. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town and Jérôme Nima in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.